بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. من قطر وزارة الثقافة والرياضة قدم بهذا البرنامج الثقافي. Let me introduce Professor ريتشارد ويكارت. He's a professor in history, specialist in intellectual history. And he has a very interesting topic, actually. We are all waiting to listen to him in this interesting topic about Darwin and social Darwinism in particular, because Darwin is a biologist. And from that point of view, he introduced a theory, but this theory passed the borders and became part of the sociology, economic, and this turnover actually, which is the part which Dr. Richard will tell us about. So the floor for you, Dr. Richard.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, in my book, From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, and Racism in Germany, I make a rather controversial argument, or at least it's become controversial. In fact, it probably shouldn't be as controversial as it is, but of course the title itself, with Darwin and Hitler both in the title, has stirred up a good deal of controversy as a result. And so I probably should start off by giving a couple of things to clear up some misunderstandings that have crept up into some of the reviews of my book and such. First of all, I don't argue that Darwinism leads inevitably to Hitler. That's rather an absurd historical argument, because there are plenty of Darwinists who haven't done the things that Hitler did. Some people have accused me of taking that position, but that's not the position that I take in the book. In fact, I don't really make a philosophical argument at all about where Darwinism ought to or should lead and such. And so if people are concerned about the fact that Hitler did use Darwinism and social Darwinism to promote his ideas, they need to take that up with Hitler and argue with him, not with me. Sometimes they're trying to argue with me about these issues when I don't even make that kind of position. Also, when I first began working on this book project, I wasn't even thinking about Hitler. And so it's not like I started off this book, this research project, trying to connect Darwin to Hitler and finding, as many threads as I could to try to do that. In fact, I began this book project as an outworking of what I'd done in my dissertation. My doctoral dissertation was on the reception of Darwinism by German socialists in the late 19th century. So I was looking at the way that socialists were interpreting Darwinism in the late 19th century, especially Karl Marx, but also Friedrich Engels and Karl Kautsky and other German Marxists of that time. But as I was doing that research I forgot to say this. While I was doing my research on my dissertation, I noticed that there were a lot of Darwinists in the late 19th century who were trying to formulate evolutionary ethics. That is, they were trying to find a way to explain human morality and ethics based on Darwinism, and then trying to sometimes even construct moral codes, and maybe not codes is maybe not the right word, but moral reasoning based upon their understanding of Darwinism. And so I began this research project looking primarily at evolutionary ethics, which is still, by the way, a fairly live topic. It's being written about quite extensively by many biologists and such even today. But while I was doing my research on my book about evolutionary ethics, I stumbled upon two different things or factors that caused me to take my research in a direction that I hadn't really thought about at first. The first one was I discovered that the German eugenics movement relied very heavily on evolutionary ethics. Eugenics is the idea that we should try to breed better people. And it was based upon Darwinian thinking that species are changeable. And so we should try to consciously make changes to humans and to create better human heredity. And so as I looked at the evolutionary ethics, I noticed that a lot of people in the eugenics movement were promoting evolutionary ethics and basing it very forthrightly on Darwinian ideology. Then a second key thing was going to happen as I was doing my research on this project, and that was that in 1995, I offered a seminar at my university on Darwinism, religion, and society. And I had my students read a book that was written by a philosopher, James Rachels, and the book was called Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism. And he was right. This is published by Oxford University Press, so a very respectable book being put out in scholarly circles. He's a philosopher, though. He's not a historian. And Rachels was arguing that Darwinism undermines the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic, and that because of that, he thinks that abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia are morally acceptable, again, based on his understanding of Darwinian theory. While I was offering that seminar, some of my students also claimed that they thought that moral relativism was substantiated by Darwinian theory. They accepted Darwinian theory, and so they said that the logical conclusion to that morally is that is moral relativism, that there aren't any fixed ethics or fixed morality. So I found that very interesting, especially in light of the fact that I'd already read the leading German 19th century Darwinist, Ernst Haeckel, who had promoted infanticide for children. So this got me thinking about these issues in a sort of a new way. And I started looking at the way that Darwinism undermined the Judeo-Christian sanctity of life ethic in the late 19th century. So I posed then this new research question then: does Darwinism devalue human life? And of course, that's a very controversial question. Some Darwinists deny that Darwinism has any kind of ethical implications. And of course, when they are confronted with the fact that many people, biologists and others, and of course Hitler himself, were going to embrace ideas about evolutionary ethics, they will say that that was distorted Darwinism, vulgar Darwinism, or some other kinds of things like that. But what I discovered in the course of my research was that many leading Darwinists from Darwin up till today do in fact argue that evolution has implications for ethics. I already mentioned James Rachels, the philosopher, his position about that. So he's just one person. In my book, though, I'm focusing primarily on the late 19th century and on German thinkers who did take this argument about Darwinism to undermine the sanctity of life ethic. Now, let me detail a number of ways. In fact, I'll look at 6 different ways in my talk today, and I lay these out in greater depth and, of course, in my book. 6 ways that Darwinism undermined the sanctity of life ethic. And when I say sanctity of life ethic, I'm talking about the ethic that life is valuable, that human life has a sacred value to it, that it's not just, we're not just a cosmic accident, as Darwinism would proclaim. So there's 6 different ways that I focus on in my book as to ways that Darwinism undermined this sanctity of life ethic. And the German thinkers that I look at, I illustrate this pretty prolifically with these German thinkers. Okay, the first one is the notion that humans are descended from animals. And Darwin himself argued that because humans were simply descended from animals, that there's no qualitative difference between humans and other animals. And in fact, in order for Darwin to make his theory plausible to his people, to his contemporaries in the 19th century, he had to argue that everything that makes up humans, including our mental capacities, but even our moral qualities, that these are all inherited from our animal ancestors. And so Darwin tried to show that other animals have morality too. And not just Darwin, but many of these German biologists and social thinkers that I detail in my book as well. So Darwin said that there's no qualitative difference between humans and animals. There's only a quantitative difference. We just have a little bit more of these kinds of moral sensibilities than other animals have, or mental capacities or physical traits and such. And so this kind of thinking has led today to ideas known as, or led today to animal rights activists promoting the notion of that by thinking that humans are higher or better than other animals, we're committing the they consider the fallacy of speciesism. This term speciesism is a takeoff on the word, of course, racism and other isms that suggest that we shouldn't consider humans more valuable than other creatures. So this notion that we're descended from animals is the first of these ways that undermines the sanctity of life ethic. A second key way that Darwinism undermined the sanctity of life ethic was by denying body-soul dualism. Body-soul dualism is the idea that humans have both a body, but we also have a soul that's separate from the body. Darwin, because he was trying to bridge the gap between humans and animals, denied that humans had any kind of separate soul. And so Darwin tried to explain all human faculties as the result of natural processes, including religion. In fact, Darwin actually provided an explanation for how religion came about in a natural way. Now, he didn't actually provide an evolutionary account of this, although some scientists today may have some kind of way of helping us to survive and reproduce better, which is what Darwinism, of course, is all about. You have to survive and reproduce. But Darwin did actually say that he thought religion had come from people fearing things that they couldn't understand. And so fearing natural things like volcanoes or storms or lightning and other kinds of things like that. And that this caused people to think that there were spirits, and that this then provided an explanation for religion. So some of the late 19th century German Darwinists that I examine are, one example is a psychiatrist. He was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, named August Forel. And Forel argued that when he was converted to Darwinism, that he just realized that humans didn't have a soul because we had just inherited all of our traits from animal ancestors and perhaps had a little bit more of different kinds of things, but we couldn't have had a real soul. Ernst Haeckel, the leading German Darwinist whom I already mentioned, also dispensed with the idea of humans having a soul. He founded an organization known as the Monist League, and monist implies unitary, being unitary, that is not having any separate soul that would be separate from the body. He founded that Monist League in 1906 to push these ideas. It was sort of a replacement for Christian, what he saw as a replacement for Christianity in Germany. Okay, the third key feature in Darwinian theory that was going to undermine the sanctity of life ethic is the idea that moral relativism, which was going to then undermine human rights. So they figured if morality simply evolved, if humans' moral senses evolved, then Darwin, as well as many other Darwinists, concluded that there is no fixed morality, and therefore there's no fixed human rights. Darwin himself, for example, said in his autobiography that one, quote, can have for his rule of life, as far as I can see, only to follow those impulses and instincts which are the strongest, or which seem to him the best ones. So Darwin didn't really think there was any fixed moral codes for humans to follow. And there were many other Darwinists in the late 19th century who took a very similar line. I discuss, for example, in my book, a prominent philosopher in Germany. He actually was in Austria. He was a professor at the University of Vienna, but that's a German-speaking place. His name was Friedrich Jodl. He was the editor of the International Journal of Ethics. And he was promoting the idea that because he thought Darwinism was true, that therefore there is no fixed morality and that ethics are relative, and so denied any kind of universal human rights. The fourth key feature of Darwinism that was going to undermine the sanctity of life ethic is the Darwinian stress on human inequality. Now, Darwin, in order to argue for his theory in the 19th century, had to argue that there was lots of variation within species. That's the only way that evolution can happen, because you have to have lots of variation for natural selection to, select those particular ones that would have different features, and then this could then accumulate, Darwin thought. Of course, Darwin didn't know genetics at the time. No one knew genetics at that time. But in any case, when applied to human evolution, Darwin had to try to show, and so did other Darwinists in the late 19th century, had to try to show that there was lots of variability within the human species. And so Ernst Haeckel, the leading German Darwinist, argued that Darwinism was inherently anti-socialism. And the reason he thought that was because he said that humans aren't equal. He said there's lots of variation within the human species. And so he used Darwinism as an argument against socialism, but also against any kind of human equality. And the eugenics movement, which I already mentioned, as the ones trying to breed better humans, they clearly saw humans as being unequal. And they very often bandied about terms such as inferiority. They talked about certain humans being inferior to other humans, certain humans being superior to other humans. And of course, they were trying to weed out, and they do use that term, weed out, the inferior elements within the human species so that they could preserve what they considered the superior ones. Very often, of course, they were looking at people with disabilities as being the inferior ones that they wanted to get rid of one way or the other. One rather dramatic example of this that I came across in my research was a medical professor named Hugo Ribert. And here's what he said. But again, this is a fairly common attitude that you find among German eugenicists. Hugo Ribert said, quote, "The care for individuals who from birth onwards are useless alike mentally and physically, who for themselves and for their fellow creatures are a burden merely, persons of negative value, is a function altogether useless to humanity and indeed positively injurious." So Ribert was saying that, there's certain people that are useless. And so he even calls them of negative value. And so these kinds of ideas were really dehumanizing certain people with various traits. And again, especially those that were mentally disabled, but also the physically disabled. And so this was promoting then discrimination against these kinds of people. Now, the eugenics movement applied this human inequality in two different kinds of ways. One that I just suggested was against people with disabilities and people that were considered inferior or weaker or more prone to illness or something like that. But they also applied it to societies competing against each other. And so this is where they embraced racism. And racism was rampant in the late 19th century, especially within these Darwinian circles. And it was often referred to as scientific racism, because they thought that Darwinian theory basically proved racial differences. They thought races were basically incipient species, they were subspecies that would eventually form into new species. And they emphasized the huge differences between the different races. In fact, I've mentioned Ernst Haeckel a couple of times, but Ernst Haeckel very clearly promoted the idea that humans were divided into different races. And Haeckel even argued that the different races, and he claimed there were 10 different races. He said these 10 different races are actually 10 different species of humans. And so he really divided out the humans, claiming that they were completely different species. And he also, in one of his books, put a series of photographs at the beginning of the book of different human races, and then had 6 different human races, and then 6 different ape species below that. And he claimed in a caption to that photo that the highest humans were more distant from the lowest humans then the lowest humans were from the highest apes. So he's saying that what he considered the lowest races were closer to apes than they were to Europeans, which he took to be, he took Europeans to be the highest of the races at the time. Just to give a more popular example, I came across this, an illustration in a popular magazine where a man was looking at, this was during World War I, and a man was looking at the captives that they had taken in World War I, and there were some Black African captives that were taken because the French were bringing in some Black colonial troops to fight in World War I. And basically, they said that the zookeepers can't catch better gorillas than we can catch on the Western Front. So basically, they're equating these Black Africans with gorillas, that they're just animals there. Okay, the fifth key feature of Darwinism that was going to undermine the sanctity of life ethic was the notion that humans are locked in a struggle for existence. Darwin believed that humans reproduce faster than the food supply, and just like any other animal or plant for that matter. And therefore, there's a struggle for existence between the different humans. And this can be between individuals, again, based on individual differences. It can also be between societies. And in this case, Darwin and many other Darwinists, and again, the 19th century Germans were especially radical in this point, believed that certain races were going to be exterminated by other races. Of course, they generally thought the Europeans were going to go out and exterminate other races, which, by the way, was happening in the 19th century. The Europeans were wiping out large populations of indigenous peoples in North America, in the Pacific Islands, in Australia, in Tasmania, and other places. And Darwin took this to be the human struggle for existence, that the Europeans were wiping out these indigenous peoples because the Europeans, they thought, were superior, and they thought that these indigenous peoples were inferior. In fact, Darwin wrote to a colleague, I think it's in the 1880s, if I recall correctly, that, quote, "The more civilized so-called Caucasian races have beaten the Turkish hollow in the struggle for existence. Looking to the world at no very distant date, what an endless number of the lower races will have been eliminated by the higher civilized races throughout the world." So Darwin thought that the racial struggle for existence was just a part of nature. In fact, in The Descent of Man, Darwin stated, quote, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." One German exemplar of this that I found was a historian named Friedrich Helwald. And Friedrich Helwald, in his book called The History of Culture, claimed that when the American Indians, or the Native Americans, were decimated by the Spaniards back in the 16th century, he claimed that this was just a part of the natural struggle for existence, and the superior ones triumphed and the other ones were destroyed. And so Helwald essentially justified the genocide of Native Americans based on his ideas about racial superiority of the Europeans. A sixth, and this is the last point I'm going to make about Darwinism undermining the sanctity of life ethic, Darwinism revised people's views about life and death, in part because of this idea of the struggle for existence that I just talked about. Under the more traditional Judeo-Christian view, death was considered an enemy that had come into the world as the result of human sinfulness. Darwinism, however, viewed death as an engine for progress. That is, the more organisms are come into existence, the more variations there are. The more variations there are, the more competition there is. The more competition there is, the more death there is. And the more death and destruction there is, then the more progress will be made in the Darwinian struggle for existence. So Darwin, in a very famous passage in The Origin of Species, for example, says, quote, "Thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely, the production of higher animals, directly follows." So Darwin was producing the secular idea of death as being a good thing because it got rid of what he saw as inferior elements and advanced the superior ones, and thus drove forward human evolution. Friedrich Helwald, whom I just mentioned, the German thinker who was promoting Darwinism as a way of explaining history, claimed that the fitter humans, quote, "stride across the corpses of the vanquished. That is natural law," Helwald said. So the death and destruction is actually there to promote evolutionary progress, according to him. Now, this was not only going to be applied to race, as I've already suggested, but it was also going to be applied to abortion and infanticide. And many Darwinists in the late 19th and on into the early 20th centuries began promoting abortion and infanticide as ways of getting rid of those that they considered inferior. So children with disabilities, kill them so that they don't contaminate the human species. I mean, that's the way that these Darwinists were seeing it. They also promoted euthanasia, and not just for people with terminal illnesses, like sometimes it's promoted today in Western societies, but euthanasia for people with disabilities. One of the historians, Ian Dowbiggin, who's at the University of Prince Edward Island in Canada, has written a book about euthanasia movement in the United States. And he said, quote, "The most pivotal turning point in the early history of the euthanasia movement was the coming of Darwinism to America." So that's how important Darwinian theory was in driving euthanasia idea, that we should kill people who have some kind of mental illness or physical incapacity, or today, a lot of times, terminal illnesses. A historian rather, who has written about the British euthanasia movement, says pretty much the same thing. Nick Kemp, who's written the best scholarly history of the British euthanasia movement, says this, quote, "While we should be wary of depicting Darwin as the man responsible for ushering in a secular age, we should be similarly cautious of underestimating the importance of evolutionary thought in relation to the question of the sanctity of human life." And indeed, that's been my experience in looking at the historical record, that indeed there were many people who were promoting abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, because they didn't think human life had any particular value based upon their idea that Darwinism had simply, through chance processes, had produced humanity. Now, I think from what I've already said, that what this has to do with Hitler may be obvious, and it became more obvious to me as I did this study. In fact, again, I wasn't even thinking of Hitler when I first started working on this project, but the more I got into it, and more I started seeing how they were how many of these Darwinists were devaluing human life and promoting infanticide and euthanasia and things which Hitler also promoted, and also racial extermination, I began realizing this does sound very much like the kinds of things that Adolf Hitler was promoting in the early 20th century. So I began investigating Hitler's views and did come to the conclusion that Hitler did believe in evolutionary ethics. Hitler was a very staunch proponent of evolution. He believed that humans had evolved from very simian species, and I discussed this extensively in my later book, Hitler's Ethic, where I talk more about these issues. But in this book, From Darwin to Hitler, my last chapter looks at Hitler's ethic and argues that he did promote an evolutionary ethic at the time. That is, Hitler was promoting the idea that both that morality had evolved, but he was also promoting the idea that whatever helps out the evolutionary process, that is, produces more superior species and variations, is good morally. And Hitler, because of that, promoted the idea that we should help evolution along just like others in the eugenics movement had already said long before Hitler came on the scene, we should help the evolutionary process along by going ahead and killing off those that he considered inferior. And so those that he considered inferior races, he wanted to kill off, and began the mass extermination against the Jews, for example. But it wasn't just against the Jews, it was also against gypsies, it was against Slavs. He killed millions of Soviet POWs, starved out populations in the Soviet Union to try to rid the areas of Slavs so that Germans could settle those areas and expand into those areas. There were all sorts of ways that Hitler was promoting these kinds of ideas of getting rid of those he considered the inferior elements and promoting those that he considered superior, which Hitler, of course, thought was the Aryan race, or the Germans, which he was then trying to promote. Now, without belaboring this point any longer, and again, you can go to the book and read it. I have a lot more information there. Let me just close off today by saying that these ideas about evolutionary ethics are not just gone. I mean, Hitler, of course, is dead. Nazism is almost dead. There are still neo-Nazis, of course, around that we still need to combat, but Nazism is a fringe movement today. However, there are a lot of scholars in the United States and Europe and perhaps elsewhere in the world who are still promoting evolutionary ethics. And so there are still some areas of here that the ideas are still very much alive. In fact, many people within the euthanasia movement in the United States, euthanasia is becoming very prominent. Many people there are using Darwinian ideas to promote this. Peter Singer, for example, is one of the most prominent bioethicists in the world today. He's at Princeton University. He has an endowed chair at Princeton. Peter Singer argues that Darwin gave what he calls should have been the final blow, the death blow to the sanctity of life ethic. Peter Singer argues pretty much similar ideas that James Rachels, whom I mentioned earlier, promoted in his book-length project about that. And Peter Singer, on the basis of his Darwinian understanding of who humans are, argues for infanticide, voluntary euthanasia, and also animals' rights. He's the one bandies around this idea of speciesism, that humans really aren't all that special in the world. Richard Dawkins, who's one of the leading Darwinian biologists and leading atheists in the world today, likewise promotes the idea that Darwinism undermines the idea that humans have any special status in the world. In 2001, in an article, he said that it would be a good idea if we did some genetic engineering to produce a sort of a missing link of the human species, something that's sort of half ape, half human. And he thought that that would destroy the illusion that humans are somehow special or sacred. So Richard Dawkins also tries to use Darwinism to undermine the idea that there's any kind of morality or human rights today. And these are just a couple of examples, prominent examples, but there's many others that I've come across in the course of my research as well. Many prominent thinkers today who are using Darwinism to try to undermine the idea that humans have any special value or uniqueness about them. And because of that, they don't think that there's anything special about human morality. They think that morality is simply evolved as well, and so that morality is just relative. Okay, now in light of all this, let me close this up here and say, does Darwinism really devalue human life? Well, I think I've shown conclusively that historically, Darwinism has indeed devalued human life, leading to ideologies that promote the destruction of human lives that are deemed less valuable by those people. Those in the forefront in promoting abortion, infanticide, euthanasia, and racial extermination often overtly base their ideas on Darwinism. Also, as I've shown, those favoring a Darwinian dismantling of the sanctity of life ethic have a good deal of intellectual firepower. These are not just some fringe people. They're people that have endowed chairs at Princeton University, for example. So these are fairly widespread in intellectual circles. Of course, this doesn't mean that everyone that believes Darwinism believes in these particular kinds of things, but it does seem to me that there's an inherent kind of logic to it that does undermine the sanctity of life ethic, which makes the idea so alluring that I doubt it will ever disappear. That is this undermining of the sanctity of life ethic, as long as Darwinism is ascendant in the scholarly world. Okay, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this has been enlightening to you. And again, you can read more in my book, From Darwin to Hitler. I also did a sequel to that book called Hitler's Ethic that looks at Hitler's ideology itself and goes into more depth about that as well. So, and in fact, there's actually a sequel to that too called The Death of Humanity that looks at how a wide variety of secular ideologies, not just Darwinism, although I do look at Darwinism as well. Also, I look at how they undermine the sanctity of life and the view that humans have unique value. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Richard. And actually, it was quite insight on all these topics and all these dimensions. So I'll leave the floor for the audience if they have questions around the subject. We will receive 3 questions in series, and Dr. Richard will answer, inshallah. Who would start that? We are waiting.
I have a question. Thank you, Mr. Richard, for this intro. In the intro, I read you talk about the enhancement of the human breed for the inferior people that they do in Germany and US. They say like only 4% of the humans are like elites or have like super like they are fine mentally and physically. And they did like some experiments on breeding them in a specific way. How did that happen? What were like the outcomes of these projects they have done? And what are their reflection on that projects?
Well, actually, there were a lot of different ways that people in the eugenics movement, which is what you're referring to here, tried to help improve human heredity. And I'm not sure exactly about the research project you're referring to, but there were lots of different ways that people in the eugenics movement tried to improve human heredity. One of the most prominent one was to try to use compulsory sterilization, that is to sterilize those that they deemed to be inferior. So that was one way to try to get rid or physically disabled in different kinds of ways. And compulsory sterilization for eugenics purposes actually began in the United States. In 1907, the state of Indiana in the United States passed a compulsory sterilization law, which meant that people who were identified by physicians as being so-called inferior types could be sterilized. And where I live here in California, a law was passed in 1909 for compulsory sterilization, where and by the way, the numbers were somewhere around in the United States, about 30,000 people were sterilized. Now, interestingly, Hitler took up these ideas about compulsory sterilization. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he embraced compulsory sterilization, and he compulsorily sterilized over 300,000 people within just a few years. So he had a very radical program of compulsory sterilization. All of this was to try to improve human heredity. It was try to help the superior to reproduce. Hitler wanted them to reproduce prolifically, as much as possible, whereas he wanted those that were identified as mentally disabled and such not to reproduce. There were lots of research projects, though, in the United States. Charles Davenport was a prominent eugenicist. He was also an avid Darwinist who was trying to apply Darwinism to human society. He ran what was called the Eugenics Records Office, which was trying to compile statistics about humans and their biological traits in order to try to improve human heredity and to try to get those top people reproducing more and the bottom people, what he saw as the bottom people, reproducing less. I hope I answered your question.
That's good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Richard. Is there any question apart from that?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Dr. Richard, I have a question regarding only Darwinist is the devaluing or maybe undermining the human value, or is there other groups also devalue the human values in your opinion?
No, it's not just Darwinism. And in fact, in my book, The Death of Humanity, which came out in 2016, I actually examine a wide variety of secular philosophies and ideologies that undermine the value of human life. Now, most of these have as their characteristic that they embrace atheism of some sort, materialism, or what's called positivism. Positivism is the idea that we can't know anything about God or an afterlife or anything like that. So I discuss actually a lot of other philosophies that do devalue human life as well in that book, The Death of Humanity. But I think Darwinism has been one of the most prominent ones. And of course, it's one of the most widespread of the ideas, especially in Western culture, in the United States and Europe in particular, but other parts of the world as well. So I think it's one of the more powerful ones. One of them, just to give an example, in my book, The Death of Humanity, I examine Nietzsche's philosophy. And Nietzsche's philosophy also undermines the ideas about human rights and the value of human life. And you can embrace Nietzsche's philosophy without embracing Darwin. In fact, some of the philosophies I examined in The Death of Humanity came about were before Darwinism. So during the 18th century, I examined, for example, the philosophy of a man named Julien de la Mettrie, who was a Frenchman who embraced materialism and wrote a book called Man the Machine. And so he saw humans as being just a machine. And that devalues human life, of course, as well. Of course, all materialists today embrace Darwinism, though, so it sort of goes together with many of these other philosophies today. But yes, there are other philosophies around that devalue human life as well.
But if this is what's happening, well, why the Western now, embrace the human rights very much to the world? If this is the history, if this is the background.
That's a great question. And of course, in the United States, the our Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we have this tradition in the West, in political tradition, of human rights. But what's interesting is that if you look at the way that human rights are being interpreted by many of these secular thinkers today, they actually see human rights as being defined by us however we want to. And so let me give an example. Michel Foucault was one of the most famous Western philosophers of the 20th century, late 20th century. He was a Frenchman, and he talks a lot about human rights and trying to press for human rights. But at the same time, he argues that human rights are created by humans, that we create human rights. So he doesn't see them as being any kind of fixed thing, like the US Declaration of Independence was saying that they're created by God and that these rights are endowed by God. Many of the people banding about the term human rights today think that these are just things that we create ourselves. And so we can pretty much define how human rights as we want to. Now, again, there's still a strong tradition within the United States, especially once you get away from intellectual circles. There's still a strong tradition of there being human rights that are fixed. And so the human rights discourse that gets used by a lot of intellectuals, they can use that to try to push for ideas that they know that the people, sort of the more common folk, will take to be unchangeable human rights when really they're not. So let me just give an example of this. In the Western culture, of course, there are many who are pushing for gay rights. Well, what do they mean by gay rights? Well, they are claiming that this that is a human right. Well, but they're also claiming at the same time that these are created rights. But they're hoping that by using the term rights, that they can convince people that this is a right, even though, of course, in many cases, they're pushing things now, like in the gay rights issues, that are actually wrongs and morally wrong.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Richard, and the time available to discuss this subject more, because it's a great insight on this topic actually, but it will open the eyes on this important issue. Thanks very much actually, and we are looking forward to see you again in the nearby future. Thanks for everybody around.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot.